those of you that weren't here yesterday, we started going through the last paragraph of the Shema. We started looking a little bit more in depth than we did the last time. But let's take a look and see, because there's a fascinating phrase over here, which is something that actually you asked about yesterday, and now we finally got to it. So your patience has paid off. But it says like this. It says, "Vaya lachem letzitzit uritem oto," that you should wear tzitzit and you should see them. And then it says, "Uzchatem et kol mitzvot Hashem." You should remember the mitzvahs, the commandments of God. Vasitim otam, and you should do them. It's not enough just to remember them. Unfortunately, you got to do them as well. So, everything comes with a little condition attached to it. And then it says, "V'lo taturu achrei levavchem v'achrei neichem." You shouldn't go after your hearts and after your eyes. Right, so yesterday, Patrick wanted to know what's the significance of that phrase. It's rather an odd phrase. You shouldn't go after your hearts and after your eyes. What the Torah is teaching us is like this. We have an obligation to look at the world and see things in the correct fashion. Everyone looks at the world through their own vision, through their own prism. The problem is, what are we seeing when we look at something? So two people can look at exactly the same thing, and one will see one detail, one will see another detail, one will say something was fantastic, the other one will say that it wasn't. One person will say it was beautiful, the other person will say it wasn't anything very special at all. There's a phrase in English that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, which I think it's very true. It really is, in everything that we do. It's fascinating how human beings we're all so different. The way that we look at things is also different as well. But the verse is coming along and saying, that you've got to look at the world in a certain way to be able to realize what it is that we're supposed to be doing over here. The bottom line is like this, not to be seduced by the physicality of what we see. Now, don't misunderstand me. That does not mean that you cannot enjoy the physical world. You definitely can, and you definitely should. However, what's the idea? The idea is like this: that there's a very fascinating. There are two different Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and there's the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud, of course, was authored where? Where was it written? Jerusalem. Very good. It was not authored in Jerusalem. It was authored in Tiberias. That's why it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. We're Jewish, what do you want? You didn't honestly think that if I was going to say the Jerusalem Talmud was authored where, that it was really authored in Jerusalem? You didn't think that, did you?
No, I'm just saying whatever was on everyone's mind.
Actually, I think you were being a little bit generous over here. I don't see too much on anybody's minds at all, actually. But the Jerusalem Talmud was actually authored in Tiberias. An interesting little bit of history. Jerusalem, of course, is the capital of Israel. Jerusalem was lying in ruins at the time. It was after one of the destructions, and the majority of the sages were living in Tiberias, and the Talmud was called the Jerusalem Talmud in order to give honor to Yerushalayim, but really it wasn't written there at all. However, there is in the Jerusalem Talmud, in a tractate called Kiddushin, it says at the end something very, very fascinating. It says that in the future, when a person gets upstairs, they're going to have to give an accounting to God of all of the pleasures of the world that they did not partake in. Now, we're talking about kosher pleasures over here, obviously, but the non-kosher pleasures you'll have to give an accounting for as well, but coming from the other direction. It's a fascinating Gemara, because the Gemara is saying like this, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, brought us into this world with physical beings. He wants us to enjoy the physicality. He really does, right? But He just wants it to do it. He wants us to do it in the right way, which means that it's okay to eat cake. It's okay to enjoy cake. The best way of eating cake, of course, is to make a blessing before you eat it. And that way, you give your little bit to God, and you can have your cake and you can eat it too, right? Which is a phrase I've never really understood.
You can't have your cake and eat it.
I don't know. It's a very strange phrase, because it's your cake. You can really do what you want with it, actually. But whatever. That's right. Take it away from him. He's only concerned for your well-being. You should know that.
No, if you eat your cake, then you don't have it anymore.
Ah, well, you do. You're just carrying it around with you.
No, not after a little bit of time.
Okay, it depends how long you've been in Israel for. If you only just arrived, then yeah, it's a very short time. But Otherwise, you can hold on to it for a little bit. Anyway, what's the idea? The idea is like this. We're physical, but we shouldn't be seduced by the physicality. The physical world is a very seductive place. It really is. And it's a difficult business, right?
No, that's my tea. Added a bit too much peppermint.
Oh, really? Okay. If I were to ask you, what do you think the order of the verse should really be? That you shouldn't go after your hearts and after your eyes. I think most of us, if we were thinking, would say that the correct order should be you shouldn't go after your eyes and after your heart, right? We would imagine that what seduces us into doing things that we shouldn't be doing is we see something that's attractive, see something that's desirous, and then we start working out how we can have it. And yet the verse says it the other way around. The verse says that you shouldn't go after your heart and after your soul. Rashi, who is the foremost commentary on the Torah, writes, Halev v'einayim he meraglim leguf. It's the most incredible thing, that your heart and your eyes are spies for your body. Mesasrim lo es averas. They sort out the averas. They sort out the sins that a person does. The body is just the end result of what the heart and the eyes are doing. And then Rashi says like this: Ha'ayin roeh, your eye sees. Halev chomed, the heart desires. Vaguf oises avera, and the body does the sin. Which means there's a process that's going on over here. You hear the idea? Which means like this, when it says, that you shouldn't go after your heart and after your eyes, we're learning the most incredible thing over here, that really what the sages are teaching, what the Torah is teaching, is that a person has desires to do things which are incorrect, to do things which are sins, and after the desire is already extant, then they look around with their eyes in order to find out how they can do it. Not the way that we would say normally, right? We would say that a person sees something and then desires it. What the Torah is saying is that deep down inside of the person, the desire is there. And afterwards, once the desire starts becoming more pressing and it becomes something that's more, bigger and bigger, at that point the person will look around in order to be able to find a way to be able to fulfill whatever it is that the desire is that they want to do. I mentioned in the past, the biggest problem with desires is that they're normally pretty pleasurable, and it's difficult. It's difficult to fight against that. It's difficult to be able to to deal with desires, especially in our generation where everything is about immediate satisfaction. When I was a kid growing up, I don't want to date myself particularly. I wouldn't want to date myself anyway, because it would be quite bizarre actually. But table for how many? 2. Whatever. But when I was growing up, fast food was really only just beginning to become something. Most places weren't fast food. Restaurants were proper restaurants, and fast food really was only just beginning to start making an entry into England in any way. I mean, it could be in America. It was probably there for years before, but England's always just a little bit behind everybody else. That's being quite, I'm being quite modest actually. England is normally very much behind everybody else. And where does fast food come from? I mean, fast food is this incredible sort of flash of tastes all coming together in one go. And, causing a person to have this incredibly pleasurable moment as they eat whatever it is that they're eating. In the olden days, people had to savor their food. It sounds quite bizarre nowadays, I think. But, you had to actually try to work out what it was that you were eating and what the different tastes were. I think if you try to do that with fast food, you'd probably never eat fast food again, actually, if you could work out what was in it. But the idea is like this, that we have to work on ourselves to be able to receive things in a way that's going to allow us to have true pleasure from what we're doing. And that means, as a rule, to try to avoid immediate satisfaction of things. So that's really what the verse over here is saying over here. There's an incredible idea that there was a very famous rabbi from the Holocaust era, Rabbi Lauffer, who was killed in Kovna. He was killed in one of the actions that the Germans rounded up everybody and they took them off to what was known as Fort 9 in the area of Kovna in Lithuania, and they machine gunned down about 2,000 people in one go. And Rabbi Yochanan Wasserman was one of the people that was there. He was one of the greatest rabbis of the generation. He was one of the closest disciples of the rabbi who was known as the Chofetz Chaim. And he writes like this. He says, no rational person could possibly doubt the fact that the world was created by God if it weren't for the fact that we were created with desire for instant gratification. Which means that in order to be instantly gratified, we first have to deny the existence of God, and then we can do whatever we want. Which means the idea of the world coming into being is something which, when a person looks at it, if you look carefully, you're able to see the fingerprints of God all over the place. People that don't want to look at it, so they won't. I mentioned the other day actually to someone sitting over here, which was on a day when there was not very many people here, that my wife's uncle was a world-renowned nuclear physicist. He actually invented the first nuclear submarine, and his boss was somebody called Admiral Rickover. He worked for the American government, and he once told me, my wife's uncle was a very, very frum man, very orthodox man, and he once told me that every bit of research that he ever did in the laboratory brought him closer to God. So I asked him, what about Admiral Rickover? Because Admiral Rickover was his partner. They worked together in the lab together. And Admiral Rickover was Jewish, but he was completely and absolutely assimilated. And he said something fascinating. He said that every bit of research that Admiral Rickover ever did brought him to the next bit of research. Which you can look at things in, you're doing exactly the same things, but you can look at it in two different ways. They were both working on the same projects together. And they were both extremely successful at what they did. And yet one of them saw the fingerprints of God over everything that he was looking at, and the other one chose to ignore them and saw the fingerprints of science all over it. That's the idea of that we have to learn how to overcome those desires. Yeah.
Desire in itself, though, is not a negative. A desire is like the source of everything.
Yeah.
Right? So
desire is great.
So the heart and the eyes, where does desire pass through these? I know it's influenced by them, but is it a soulful kind of thing that
is desire? You mean is desire a trait in and of itself? Is that the question?
I think that is correct. I think it is. But my question is more like it has to come from somewhere. So is it a soulful kind of thing, or is it
interesting?
A physical?
I'm not sure. I tell you why. Animals have desires. When we talk about human beings behaving in a way that's not very good, we talk about the animalistic desires of human beings, which I think is a little bit unfair to animals, to be honest, because animals are created in the way that they're created with desire, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. When human beings behave in a way, when human beings behave like animals, I don't think it's fair to say that that's animalistic, because human beings are behaving like non-humans. That doesn't mean they're behaving like animals, because animals are doing what God told them to do. But I think that there are two dimensions, like everything really. There are two dimensions to desire. There's the physical desires that we have, and the physical desire is something, it's absolutely of paramount importance. Without physical desire, there will be no future generation, right? Which means that physical desire is neither good nor bad. What we do with our physical desires is going to turn it into something good or something bad. Which means that a person can control his desires and channel them into, for example, just that, to keep this obvious and simple, channel it into married life and raise a family, or a person can choose to live out his desires outside of that framework in all kinds of different relationships, and then it's taking exactly the same force and just being used in a different way, that's all. But there has to be spiritual desire as well. And spiritual desire is the desire to want to become closer to God. Spiritual desire can be translated, if it's misused or if it's misunderstood, can be translated into idol worship, or it can be translated into not believing in God at all. You're taking exactly the same force and you're just channeling it into a different direction. Which means that, like most things, we are, human beings are the only part of the creation which is created with a duality. We're physical and we're spiritual. And that means that everything that we've got is going to be able to be translated into the physical and the spiritual as well. We have to learn how to utilize all of those various powers that God has given us, and learn how to utilize them and channel them and have them work for our benefit. Right? And that's I always use this as an example, but I think to me it's perfectly clear. The word for marriage inside of Jewish law is kiddushin. Kiddushin comes from the word kadosh. Kadosh means holy, sanctified, something which is separate from everything else. And to me it's clear. Marriage has a very physical dimension to it. Whether it's intimacy or whether it's just the more physical dimensions of day-to-day marriage. But nevertheless, it's called kiddushin, which means that we can take that physicality and we can turn it into something which has got a spiritual dimension to it. It's got a holy dimension to it. It's the same with everything that we do, right? We can take a piece of cake and you can make a bracha over it, and now all of a sudden that piece of cake has become a physical entity with a spiritual flavor to it, right? Or a person, everything that we do in our lives, we can utilize this side, the physical side, and turn it into a spiritual dimension, and we can also choose to squash the spiritual dimension and just have it as just keep it in the realms of the physical. I'm going to say something over here which is going to be a little bit difficult for some people to relate to, I think, at this moment, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's rather important, actually. There is a very important Rashi. Again, Rashi is the foremost commentary on the Chumash. Rashi says like this: where does the desire to let go a person? We're talking about a religious person who wants to let go of his connection to God, right? Where does that desire come from? So Rashi says that there are seven dimensions, there are 7 steps in a person's letting go of his relationship with God. And it starts off, believe it or not, he says like this: Hari Sheva Averis, there are 7 sins. Harishona Goreris Hashnia, V'chener Hashvius, the first one leads you to the second one to the 3rd one, until you get to the 7th one. The Eluhein, this is what Rashi says, these are they. It all sounds very mundane at the beginning. It says, Loi Lomad, a person doesn't learn Torah. That's sin number 1. The person doesn't learn Torah, so what happens next? So, Loi Osa, then he doesn't do the mitzvahs. Part of the concept of learning Torah is that the more we know, the better we can perform what it is that we're supposed to do. That's something, that's a concept which is not applicable just to religion. That's applicable to everything, right? That we've got to, anyone in a profession, so you'll know that under normal circumstances, your profession is always in a state of flux. It's always changing. It's always growing. It's becoming, there's more details that need to be understood. And if that's the case, then a person needs to be in a constant state of studying in order to be able to be good at whatever it is that they do. Right? What's true in the realms of in the realms of medicine, and what's true in the realms of accounting or law is true in the realms of religion as well. Right? The more that we learn, the more that we study, the greater is our ability to be able to do things properly. If a person doesn't study, then he won't do. What's the 3rd step, says Rashi? At that point, the person then becomes disgusted with the people who are doing. Right? Well, the source of that disquiet is what? That if I know that I'm supposed to be doing something and I see other people that are doing it, it bothers me that they're doing it. Right? We're all guilty of this in different ways and different flavors. That's who we are. That's human nature. Says Rashi, what happens after? What's the next stage? Soines hachachomim. That he begins to hate the rabbis, because the rabbis, of course, are the ones that are telling people what they're supposed to do. And if I don't want to do what it is that other people are doing, then I don't want to be told what it is that I'm supposed to be doing either. And then, monees acherim, then he stops other people from doing it, which means that he'll go out and he'll preach against keeping things. He'll go out and preach and say, like Korach tried to teach the Jewish people that you don't have to keep all of these things. It's okay. Your relationship with God is something which is personal. It's something which is unique. You don't have to worry about, whether you do it like this or you do it like that or you do it the other way. One of the classic complaints that people have is that, Judaism is a religion which is ruled by the rabbis. The rabbis make up all kinds of commandments that we're supposed to keep in order to, they want to keep us in check. That's all. They just want to keep us under control. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with Jews, but the idea of, controlling Jews, it's pretty bizarre, right? I mean, we are the most critical nation in the world. We are the most contrary nation in the world as well, actually. There's this famous idea that if you've got to put 3 Jews in a room, you'll have at least 4 opinions. We got something to say about everything. The idea of some kind of murky, quasi-official body of rabbis that are able to control the Jewish people by telling them that they can't do this or they can't do that, or they're allowed to do this or allowed to do that. I don't know. I mean, again, I know a lot of Jews, and I'm not convinced that it makes an awful lot of sense. After they've reached a point where they're trying to stop other people from keeping the mitzvot, so says Rashi, koifer b'mitzvot. At that point, of course, in order to make people think that they shouldn't be keeping the mitzvot, they have to deny the mitzvot. Now you have to deny the divinity of the mitzvot. The mitzvot don't come from God. You don't have to worry. God really doesn't care what you do or what you do. And then, koifer be'ikar, at that point, after you've already denied the mitzvot, the only thing that's left to do is to deny God himself.
How can the step of kofer b'mitzvot come after lo lamad? If he didn't learn, then he doesn't know. And if he doesn't know, then what's he being kofer in? Something he doesn't know.
Very good. Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing, but if you watch human beings that don't know about other things, maybe things that they should know about, not just in religion, not just in religious terms, but in general in life, they will completely belittle whatever those things are, because that's it. What's the only other alternative is to learn about them. Right? It's just the way that it goes, right? So you see people in all different walks of life, where you've got people who are very careful about certain things, and other people who are in the same profession. They look and say, "Oh, that guy's nuts. Why is he doing it like that?" And the guy's doing it like that because even though it's making his life harder, it means that he's going to do something a lot more effectively. But if I don't want to waste my time studying about that, and I don't want to waste my time having to do it. So there's really only one defense that I've got, which is what? Is to say, well, that's a load of nonsense. Whatever he's saying is nonsense. Whatever he's doing is nonsense. You hear the idea, though. What Rashi's saying is absolutely extraordinary. It really is. We're not talking about people that don't know anything, who are on the beginning of their voyage to try to discover God. Rashi's talking about people who are religious. They do know, and they end up at the end. They end up denying God, and all of that begins from not learning. A person doesn't learn Torah, then it's a problem. There's a very famous story. Back if you go back 100 and something years in Jewish history, 150, 180 years in Jewish history, there was a movement, the movement called the Maskilim, the Enlightenment movement, which made terrible inroads into the Jewish world. It started off with Moshe Mendelssohn and Avram Geiger, who were the sort of like the founding fathers of the movement. And it was a movement that it denied the divinity of Judaism. It really did. And yeshivot all over Europe were being oppressed by the maskilim, by the Enlightenment movement. It wasn't, these people, it wasn't enough for them that they didn't want to believe anymore, but they went out on a milchemes mitzvah, they went out on a holy war against Judaism. They didn't want people to believe.
Is it Reconstructionist?
Not Reconstruct, that came much later on, but rather what's called the Enlightenment movement, which you should know that a little bit of history, Moses Mendelssohn was the most unbelievable Talmid Chacham. I mean, the man was absolutely brilliant.
How did he get to the step of kofar if he was Lamad?
Oh, because that's an interesting question. I mean, maybe the answer over here is Lo tatu achei levavchem v'achei einechem. The desire was already there inside of him. The desire was there. His connection was pretty tenuous to begin with. That's also something else which is pretty fascinating. There are two ways of learning Torah. You can learn Torah as an intellectual pursuit, right? Which means that you've got people today who are professors of Talmud, who, if they're Jewish, are not the least. They're not the least bit orthodox. But they are, they delve into the Talmud in a way that most people would love to be able to do, and they love every second of it. But it's a purely intellectual pursuit. It doesn't touch on their soul at all. Apparently, in South Korea, there is a movement to learn Talmud. Some of the Talmud is being translated into Korean, which is, again, it's weird, right? But somebody who's very intellectual. So the Talmud is enormous. Even in Hebrew, it's called the Yama Talmud. It's an enormous sea of knowledge that really has no limit to it. So what's the pshat? What happened over there with Moses Mendelssohn? I don't know. It's an interesting question. What forced him into the path that he took? I'm not sure. But what was fascinating was that at the beginning of the Enlightenment movement, it was being run by people who were they were very brilliant. They knew an awful lot. They didn't look any different from any other religious Jew. But their the things that they believed in, their religious theology was incorrect, and it started evolving into something else altogether. If my memory serves me correct, Mendelssohn had 6 children, 3 of which baptized and 3 of which married out. Wow. Which means that the minute you start playing around with Judaism, the idea of being able to hold on to it is not really there. In Yeshivat Volozhin, which was considered to be the most prestigious yeshiva in Eastern Europe at the time, there were also boys that were learning in the yeshiva that they became enlightened, in inverted commas. They joined the Enlightenment movement, and they didn't keep anything anymore. And they tell over a story. Listen carefully to the story because it's very, very deep. They tell over a story that Rav Chaim Volozhin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, once bumped into 3 of his ex-Talmidim. They used to learn in the yeshiva, and they weren't the least bit frum anymore. They weren't the least bit orthodox. And Rav Chaim Volozhin looked at him and he says to them, mein Kinder, he says, my children, he says, what happened to you? And they said, Rebbe, we had questions. As if we had questions and that caused us to make the choices that we made and not to believe anymore. So Rav Chaim Volozhin, he was a pretty smart fellow, right? He happened to be the foremost student of the Vilna Gaon, which means he was beyond brilliant. He looks at these boys and he says, tell me, he says, did you have questions before you left the yeshiva or after you left the yeshiva? So I guess in those days people still told the truth, right? So they said, well, Rebbe, really, we had questions after we left the yeshiva. So Rav Chaim Volozhin says to him, no, those aren't questions, those are answers. A person makes a decision of what they want to do, and then they'll build an ideology around that in order to be able to live whatever it is that they want to do. Yeah.
I remember I was reading someplace about the difficulty that survivors of the Holocaust, the older they got, one of the most difficult statements for them to make was Ivri Anochi. Like, they just, to say that, and, with any meaning, I guess, was nearly impossible from that experience.
Yeah, I mean the Holocaust itself was an astonishing lesson. Some people, nobody's judging anybody over here, but some people came out with their strength, strengthened, I guess, and some people came out with their strength completely removed. It's interesting. I don't know. Interesting thing, you know. But two people went through exactly the same experience over there. One of them came out, you know, completely believing in God, and the other one came out completely not believing in God. Yeah. So you want to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say when I worked at the Museum of Tolerance back in LA, and a lot of the Holocaust survivors that I've come across.
It's a nuclear alert. Don't pay any attention.
When the bomb fell down. They were atheists, openly atheists, and do you blame them?
No. I feel you know, I really feel for them. I really do, because I think that there can't be. You shouldn't have shut the door. Right? there can't be very much worse than going through something as enormous as the Holocaust, and not having anything, you know, not having any kind of something to just to be able to try to understand the small amount that we can. But it's not for anybody to judge, you know, when they went through what they went. First of all, we should never have to experience anything remotely similar to whatever they experienced. And you know, it's not, certainly not for us to judge, you know, oh, look at him, you know, he's not frum today. That's, you know, that's really a not valid reaction to what happened to people. You should know there's a most astonishing story. Rabbi Beryl Wine, who is, you know, probably the foremost Orthodox historian alive today, he used to have a yeshiva in Monsey before he retired and came over here to Israel. He used to have a yeshiva in Monsey, and he told over the most incredible story. He said that in one of his graduating classes, there was a boy graduating from the yeshiva whose, you know, the parents obviously come to graduation day, and the parents were not they weren't Orthodox. And after the graduation, Rabbi Wine went over to ask the parents, you know, to ask the father why if they weren't why did they send their kid to yeshiva? So he told him the most astonishing story. This fellow said that he was brought up in communist Russia. He was brought up before the Second World War. He was born, and his parents were such incredible believers in communism that they didn't even give him a bris milah. He was never circumcised. And he said that's what saved him during the Second World War, when the Nazis came through. You know, they managed to conquer parts of Russia at the beginning. When they came through, one of the easiest ways they had of identifying who was Jewish and who was not was by seeing that the person had a bris milah, they were shot, and if they hadn't, they didn't. And he said he was saved in one of the actions that the Nazis took. He was saved because they lined everybody up and they checked to see who had a bris milah and who didn't, and anyone who didn't was allowed to go free. So he said at some point he got married. He actually got married to a Jewish woman, and they had this kid. Bless you. And at some point they left Russia. They were able to get out and they came to America. In America, there was an organization, bless you, which might still exist. Actually, I think it was called Bris Avram, which was they trying to convince people that hadn't had a bris milah to have a bris milah. And somehow or other, they found out that this man had not had one, and they started driving him nuts. Until finally, in desperation, trying to get out of their grips, he agreed to have a bris milah. And then they found out that his son hadn't had a bris milah either. So they drove him nuts about that as well, until finally they had a bris milah together at the same time. And afterwards, when the father, you know, after he got over the bris milah, the operation, the father realized to himself, he says, hold on a second. He says, you know, the whole reason for not having a bris milah and for not giving my son a bris milah was that, you know, come the next Holocaust, that we should be able to survive. He says, if we've just had a bris milah, that means that we're identifiable as Jews, he says, so at least I should send my son off to get an education so that he should know what he's dying about. So he sent his kid off to yeshiva. And this was a kid that was graduating, right? I don't know. It's an incredible story. If you know your Holocaust history, the last train that got taken off to Auschwitz, the war was already lost. had 350 completely assimilated or even non-Jewish people on board. And they were all killed when they got there. When they got to Auschwitz, they were killed straight away. I don't know. I can't think of anything more terrible than dying as a Jew if you weren't even aware of the fact that you were Jewish. Some of these people, their families had baptized, a generation prior to that, and they really didn't even know that they were Jewish. And yet, according to Nazi law, that's what they were. And they were taken off and they were killed. I think, I don't know, the way we need to know who we are, right? We need to know that we're Jewish, and we need to be proud of the fact that we're Jewish. How much you keep, how much you don't keep, all right, that's negotiable, right? But to be proud of the fact that we're Jewish in order to be able to live out our lives over here knowing that we're different from everybody else. That's really what we have to do. And in order to be able to do that, so we have to not be seduced by our hearts and by our eyes. Says the verse in the last paragraph of Shema. It says, "Asher atem zonim achareihem," and the sequence is clear. If we follow our hearts and our eyes, what will happen? It's as if we're being unfaithful to God. So we're doing things that we're not supposed to do. So I saw there's a very beautiful idea in the Psalm of the day on Yom Chamishi, on Thursday. King David uses a phrase over there. It says, "V'lo yeh b'cha el zar," that you shouldn't have strange gods in your midst, right? Which means that you shouldn't get involved in idol worship. One of the famous Hasidic rabbis, the Rebbe Mikotsk, famous for his very sharp statements, he switches the concept, the context of the verse around, and he says, "Lo yeh b'cha kel zar," don't make God a stranger to you. Which means that all of this, the difficulties that we have in doing what we're supposed to do are compounded by a person not being sure, or not being sure that he's got a relationship with God to begin with. The stronger our relationship is, the more we're prepared to do. It's the same in anything. We're not just talking over here about religion, we're talking about everything. It's true in personal relationships, it's true in professional relationships as well. In personal relationships, the more you're prepared to do for somebody else, the greater is the extent of the relationship. There's Rav Dessler, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers from the previous generation. He says that the word love in Hebrew, anybody know what the word love is in Hebrew? Ahava. Right? Ahava. And he says that the Ahava is spelled Aleph, Hey, Bet, Hey. Ahava. And he says that the essence of the word Ahava is the word have. Hey, Bet. Hey, Bet means to give to somebody else. How do you show somebody that you love them? Give them things. It doesn't have to be physical things, but give them emotional support. Show them that you love them. You can buy them things as well, right? It's an incredible idea, right? Ava, the way that we show our love for somebody else is through how much we're prepared to give to the other person. You should know there's an astonishing. The Arizal, you were just in Tzfat, so you went to it. Did you go to his mikveh?
No, I've been there before, but we didn't.
Okay, the Arizal's mikveh is over there in Tzfat in the old cemetery over there. It's an astonishing place because it's freezing cold. Even in the summer, it's freezing cold over there. In the winter, it's even more freezing cold. I'm very surprised that Rabbi Geffen didn't insist that you all break the ice and immerse inside of it. But the Arizal says that on Purim, there's a very beautiful mitzvah on Purim to give things to other people, give gifts to other people. And the Arizal says that really you should give gifts to people that you don't like. Because when you give gifts to people that you don't like, you build up a relationship with them. So the other person thinks to himself, wow, he's not as bad as I thought he was. And then he'll give you a gift back and you'll think, wow, you know what, he's not as bad as I thought he was. And all of a sudden, you can start building up a relationship and you can actually become quite close to somebody who you originally didn't like. That's Ava. That's what love is all about, the idea of giving to other people. Okay, we're going to stop over here because Rabbi Geffen is trying to limit the amount of love that I have for you people. I'm happy to sit here and just, keep going and keep going and keep going. But
Thank you, Rabbi.